Well, good morning, everybody, and let me help you place the accent. Born in Zimbabwe, grew up in London, now living in New York. So there could be many different tones that you hear in there. I'm going to start this by describing the last 3 years, just in a quick snapshot, but an incident which arose 3 years ago. I'd been running a media business in the UK, and I was taking my then 17-year-old son on a 100-mile hike. And it's a wonderful age to have a week with a 17-year-old, and I was filling him with all of a father's instruction of the many things he had to do in life. And, follow your heart, follow your stomach, follow your passions, all of those things. And on day 2, he suddenly stopped. He said, "Dad, I've been listening to you for 2 days. How much of what you say I should feel do you feel every day in the office?" And that caused a bit of a silence. And that evening, when we were going pub to pub on this. It wasn't a pub crawl, but it was a hike. I have to say, there was a bona fide hike. It's a beautiful place to go. I'll tell you about it another day. But I reached the pub where we spent our night, and I picked up the phone. I called my chairman, and I said, "I'm calling time. A year from now, I'm out because I need to feel those things back in my life." And about 6 weeks later, the phone went. And serendipity is often like that. It is by definition serendipitous. But the phone went, and it was a recruiter from New York who said there's this fantastic opportunity. She spent a lot of time telling me about it, and she wouldn't tell me the name of the company. And I said, "Look, it's all rather abstract. Sounds very interesting, my values, education, yada, yada. What is it?" And she said, "Well, it's McGraw-Hill Education. Would you like to come and run it? Are you interested?" And I said, "Well, that's the easiest question you've ever asked, because the answer is no. I have zero interest in an old textbook company with a broken business model, producing flat content and trying to push stuff into a market which is going to change. My background's software and media, and I want change." So there was a pause. Anyway, we began a conversation, and 6 months later, I joined. Where I announced I was joining. I had to work out the rest of my notice. And I'm pleased to say that now 2 years in, I'm the sort of those instincts that I had at the beginning about what was emerging inside of McGraw and also in the wider world of education have been borne out, and we're making a huge pivot. And it did coincide with the business being sold, and so I had the opportunity with my colleague Mark and others to lead a pretty profound shift. But that shift has been about taking us back to our roots, and the roots are where all of you are, which is how do you make a difference. So a lot of the work that we've been thinking about comes back to how do we make ourselves relevant, and how do we make a contribution. And I guess the start point for the work that we've been doing and thinking about the way we'd think about software was to look for those bits of learning and education which are effectively timeless, those fundamental truths that we know. So this is a piece of work many of you will know. In fact, I'm sure all of you will. Benjamin Bloom produced this. And this fantastic piece of work really said, look, if you have a group of students of the same ability and you teach them in different ways, you can get, no surprise, very different outcomes. And it's not that the students are different, it's that the outcome is different based on the mode of instruction and the interaction between student, instructor, and effectively, in some way, shape or form, the pedagogy, the materials that they use, how they access the world around them. So here's that conventional lecture class with a big tail, and I was actually, funnily enough, I was at a college here in Sydney, and somebody was describing this as they were lecturing to a very big group. And they said, my bottom third, they're lost. I know it on day one, they're lost. I can't do anything for them. So we began to think about that, and we thought about the difference between what we call master or mastery learning, and then, of course, the dream of tutorial if one could afford it. And we began to say, could we incorporate the things which make mastery learning different, which tighten the distribution, which effectively Benjamin described this as the 2 sigma problem, but would move all grades up effectively by a whole grade, a massive educational gain. And we've begun to come around ways of thinking that we could. And again, the heart of this has been to sit back and think about what it is that helps people to learn. How do we actually plug into all the research that's out there, and how do we instrument that research? So some bits of it very old. Ebbinghaus, his papers are 100 years before Bloom, and he's talking about how memory shifts from short-term, how you put things into short-term memory and how you move things from short-term memory to long-term memory. Interestingly, nobody's ever put that into software until we have, which is to think about the way the repetition, the frequency with which materials come up consciously to promote learning in that concrete way. Metacognitive theories, the theory of deliberate practice, we all know them because they're evidenced out there and well established. But a part of our journey has been to say, could we incorporate these, as well as the game design and thoughts about how we build engagement, into next generation instructional materials, which make them much more than just a passive PDF or a piece of content. And we think we're on the cusp of it, and the first generations of what we're doing are there. And we call it, this broad subject is learning science, but we say that the heart of this starts with, can we promote instructor and student success? And the two are intimately bound together. Can we allow for an environment where the instructor is going to sit and look at a class and say, I don't need to determine where you are just by looking at you, which is sadly the case all too often now, where people look into the class and they know who the top third is all too quickly. And likewise for the student, how do we get to an environment where every student can actually fulfill their potential? How do we plug into that part of our past, which is content, which is pedagogy, which is really relevant because curation remains important, but it's not as important. So we've got a different place in that world. And then how do we harness those bits of learning science? So for us, the route forward has been to really say, here are the pillars on which we're building things. We believe in proven content. We don't think it's the only path in. We think it's part of, by definition, an ecosystem. So as we look to build programs now, we're being very consciously creating the APIs which allow us to incorporate other people's content, because that's a part of the whole, and that's very important. Critically, and this is the way we engage those bits of psychology crudely, are how do we incorporate learning science through software to promote faster learning. And on the back of that, which means creating personalized paths for people, making sure they see the appropriate thing at the right time, in sequence, taking them back to prerequisites that they may not know, that they didn't know. How do we identify conscious competence and its evil twin, unconscious incompetence, and allow us to really spot and help the student at that individual level? And crucially, that brings up the subject of data. And we're now in a place where we can generate amazing amounts of data. And I just want to share this. This is sort of, I think, the single most important thing I've got here. We call this a heat map. And this is a piece of content described on this slide which has been instrumented. What do I mean by that? Each little bit of the content has been tagged to a set of probes or questions relating to specific learning objectives. And what we're able to suddenly start to do is look at student success at the individual learning objective level related to one bit of content. And the little magnifying glass, so the color loosely reflects the progress of that student, where dynamically the content is effectively highlighting itself or unhighlighting itself based on, do you know it, and do you know you know it, and or not. And around that, we're beginning to see these interesting little stats emerge. That little box which is circled here has 3 stats in it, which now goes back actually to every single author and all of our instructional designers. The number of students who've taken that particular question, the length of time it took them to respond to the specific probe, which could be anything, actually 17 different kinds of questions it could be, but at the bottom end of the pile would be multiple choice, but there's a whole array of richer forms of diagnostics on top of that, and the proportion which are correct. So in this case, 6,686 students took the probe, took them 30 seconds, and less than half of them got it right. So when we're editing now, we've changed. We used to think about editing our content in terms of wise judgment of subject matter experts as to where the subject was, or that was on the good days, and on the bad days, need to make a revised edition because the business model required a new edition to go out there. And that's the way all publishers worked. Now, I see the end of the edition coming because the evergreen is going to be with us. Now we're editing based on, does that little molecule of the content work or not? Does that individual sentence make sense to the student or not? And now we're not doing it on the basis of the learned judgment of the academy. We're doing it on the observed results of students. And not one student, but thousands upon thousands of them. So our authors are now getting, it's really exciting to work with authors because they are so alive now because they're getting a sort of feedback that they've never, ever had. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, of course, is where does the other outputs of this data go? And it really goes to three ways. I've described what it does for us. That's just kind of so what for you all, but it's very important for us. The other two bits, the first, of course, is to the learner themselves. And crucially, a part of this mode of questioning and probing is identifying confidence, which is so much a part of learning. Well beyond did you get it right or not, is did you know you got it right and are you sure about it? We're all too well aware of the sort of the trope of, sometimes not a trope actually, of that slightly overconfident young man and that slightly underconfident young woman facing the same problem and responding very differently. We're suddenly able to give that back to the student. You think you know it, but you don't, at a very granular level. And you think you don't know it, but you do, so you should feel better about yourself. So one aspect back to the learner, critically back to instructor. And here the sort of system is when we think about the rate at which people fail to complete the courses that they should be completing, it's too late by the time they've taken their terminal exams, it's too late to make any effective intervention. We're now in a position where we can intervene and support intervention, not we can intervene, we can provide the data to an instructor to say, Joe or Sue or Mary has a problem yesterday on their assignment, and this is where it is. And those insights can come through both at the granular individual level or at the section level. Your section has a problem with. The instructor I was with yesterday at this college was talking about he's got a mandate to flip his classroom for next year. He doesn't quite know what that means. And I said, well, how about having a system where before you come into your class, you were actually able to say, here's the subject I want to address today, which isn't necessarily lecture 4 of a 12 lecture series that you've given many times before. It's lecture 4, which you've defined by the challenges they faced now, and you're able to pass the group into those who get it, those who are struggling with it, those who need to push forward and really make the most of that moment. So very exciting in terms of what real-time data does. And lest you think this is all hot air at this point, this is where we actually are. And this is the sort of the crude numbers of it. Let me start at the top left. 3 years ago, we had 40 of our titles across our whole corpus, which we had painfully begun to instrument. We've now done that to 1,400, pretty much our entire body of work. And in fact, as we author, we're breaking, the new model of authoring is in fact breaking the model of the book into subcomponents, submolecules as it were, which will allow for a different form of assembly, which is pretty exciting. We deliver it through a platform called Connect, which is effectively the entity which manages the relationship between the student on the one hand and faculty or the single instructor on the other. And last year, 3 million students, primarily in the US, but also a nice body of them here, were engaged in Connect with 89 million assignments being completed. So the numbers are beginning to be substantial. We then have two broad families of adaptive engines. On the maths and chemistry side, a platform called Alex, which is now sufficiently mature that we've got third-party peer-reviewed journal documented evidence saying we can get the Benjamin Bloom effect. And we're actually wonderfully pleased and proud about that. 1.7 million students using that now, and growing pretty quickly, as you'd imagine, with crucially 3.6 billion interactions. And the AI in there is learning from each interaction and improving itself, the system, very quickly. And then the other family, Smart Book and Learn Smart, two sides of the same coin, 5 billion interactions growing at 100 million a month. And that's the heat map. And that covers literally every single subject that we run, from anthropology to zoology, literally. So that's a little bit about us. But the crucial thing for us is redefining what we do to be relevant and engaging and creating an opportunity. And the first opportunity that we see there is that with all this data, we think we've got an amazing way of interacting with the world of the academy in a material way. We've now created a research council. We're looking for academics to partner with to make this data available for their studies, because we think it's truly a unique set of data on how people learn. And so if any of you here are aware of colleagues or you yourselves are interested, we actually have a process now to begin to open up this to people to allow for that independent study. And that, I hasten to say, some of you might be depressed, some of you might be relieved. We won't fund it because we don't want to be associated with it. It has to be standalone in its own right on the part of the academy. And the second is that we made the decision to separate our software from our own content. And so whilst we have 1,400 courses of our own material out there, we've started to partner with universities who feel very strongly that they've got their own content and they want to instrument it and they want it to work. And we've built, because we had to ingest 1,400 of our own works, we built a wonderful tool set to allow for the ingestion of any part of content. Not just a book, by the way. It could be in any form whatsoever. Increasingly, it's video, but it could be a PowerPoint. It could be any form of media whatsoever, and instrument it. We think that engine itself is a very valid tool for educational research, because we're suddenly able to allow A-B situations of, does the student learn A or B through the same system, and flip and get those very quick responses between the cohorts of how many took it, what confidence, and with what accuracy, which therefore allows for much more effective and faster cycle times in research. So we're very excited about that. It's very real, and it creates an opportunity for us, because for us the whole point comes back to the fundamental reason to exist. Our license to be here is to be useful and make a contribution. And if we can do that, we'll build a great business. But if we can do that, we'll also feel fantastic. So that's a little introduction to us. Thank you. And I've now interrupted the distribution of breakfast, but I think we'll move back to Cindy. Thank you.